The transport helicopter's rotors churned the Antarctic air with mechanical precision, each beat a reminder of how far I was from anything resembling civilization. My name is Elliot Walker, and at 28, I had finally landed the research position that would define my career in geophysics. A full year at Station Kepler, one of the most isolated research outposts on the planet. The helicopter descended through air so cold it seemed to crystallize around us, approaching a cluster of prefabricated buildings that looked like metallic insects against the endless white expanse of the Antarctic plateau. From above, the station appeared impossibly small, a fragile collection of human engineering, dwarfed by ice sheets that stretched beyond the horizon in every direction. The pilot's voice crackled through my headset. "Welcome to the end of the world. Dr. Walker, hope you brought your sense of humor. You're going to need it." Station Kepler had been constructed in the late 1970s as part of an international cooperative research initiative designed to monitor seismic activity and atmospheric conditions in one of Earth's most inhospitable environments. The facility consisted of 6 interconnected modules buried beneath accumulated snow and ice, connected by insulated tunnels that protected personnel from surface conditions that could kill an unprotected human in minutes. Dr. Harper met me at the landing pad, a woman in her 50s whose weathered face suggested decades of exposure to environments that tested the limits of human endurance. She moved with the economic efficiency of someone who had learned to conserve energy in a place where every calorie mattered. Every motion had to be calculated against the constant drain of maintaining core body temperature in sub-zero conditions. "Transport leaves in 30 minutes, she said, leading me through the station's main airlock with practiced urgency. "We'll get you oriented quickly. Winter protocols don't allow for extended surface time during equipment transfers." The interior of Station Kepler was utilitarian in the extreme, bare metal walls, lined with monitoring equipment, heating ducts, and storage compartments labeled in multiple languages. The air carried the distinctive smell of recycled atmosphere, heating oil, and the particular metallic tang that develops in closed systems where the same air has been circulated for months without natural refreshment. Dr. Harper conducted the orientation with military efficiency, covering emergency procedures, communication protocols, and safety equipment, with the thoroughness of someone who understood that oversight in the Antarctic could be fatal. But it was when she handed me the laminated instruction sheet that the briefing took an unexpected turn. "Station rules," she said simply, sliding the paper across the duty table. "Read them, follow them. So don't question them." The document was titled "Rules for Survival at Station Kepler," in block letters that looked official despite the bizarre content. "Never approach the outer perimeter at night. If you hear knocking at the door after 3 a.m., do not answer, never engage with the shadowy figures near the fuel tanks. Always keep the radio on, even if it's silent. Do not venture outside alone between sunset and sunrise." I read through the list twice, waiting for Dr. Harper to crack a smile or provide some explanation that would place these instructions in a rational context. When she didn't, I looked up with what I hoped was diplomatic curiosity. "Is this some kind of initiation ritual?" I asked. "Hazing for new researchers?" Harper's expression remained perfectly serious. "The rules exist for reasons you'll understand soon enough. Antarctica doesn't forgive mistakes, and some mistakes are worse than others." The helicopter pilot appeared in the doorway, signaling departure preparation, with gestures that suggested familiarity with abbreviated communication in extreme environments. Harper gathered my transportation paperwork and headed toward the exit, pausing only to offer final guidance that carried more weight than casual advice. "First rule of Antarctic survival," she said, checking her watch with the precision of someone tracking time against survival margins. "When you don't understand something, assume it's dangerous and follow established protocols." The rules work because they've been tested by people who didn't survive the testing process. After the helicopter disappeared into the white void beyond the station's perimeter, I found myself alone in the common area, reading through the rules again while trying to apply rational analysis to instructions that seemed designed to govern interactions with entities that shouldn't exist according to any scientific framework I'd studied during my graduate training. The station was quieter than I'd expected. Not the absence of sound, but a different kind of sound, mechanical rhythms and atmospheric processing that created an acoustic environment unlike anything I'd experienced in populated areas. Wind moved around the exterior structures with a constancy that felt almost musical, and somewhere in the heating system, metal expanded and contracted with regular percussion that could almost be mistaken for knocking if you weren't paying careful attention to the source. I unpacked my equipment in the small personal quarters that would serve as my private space for the next 12 months, organizing instruments and personal effects, while trying to process the isolation that was already beginning to affect my perception of normal social rhythms. Outside the single small window, the Antarctic landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, white on white under a sky that looked too pale, too empty, too vast for human comprehension. The rule sheet sat on my desk, laminated edges catching the artificial light from overhead fixtures that would provide the only illumination during the 4-month period when the sun would disappear entirely below the horizon. I told myself the instructions were probably practical guidelines disguised as mysterious prohibitions, warnings about equipment hazards, wildlife encounters, or environmental dangers that the station's previous personnel had learned to avoid through hard experience. But as evening settled over, Station Kepler and the temperature outside dropped to levels that would freeze exposed human tissue in seconds. I found myself checking door locks and window latches with care that went beyond normal security concerns. The rules might have been nonsense, but they were also all I had to guide me through my first night in an environment where the difference between life and death could be measured in degrees of temperature, minutes of exposure, or decisions made without adequate understanding of consequences. That might not become apparent until it was too late to correct them. The Antarctic wind continued its constant commentary on the fragility of human shelter, and somewhere in the mechanical sounds of the heating system, I thought I heard rhythms that didn't quite match the regular patterns of automated equipment cycling through its programmed operations. My first assigned task came during the 3rd day of my residency, when Dr. Harper instructed me to perform a routine inventory of the fuel supply stored in the external storage facility, approximately 50 yards from the main station complex. The work was mundane but essential. Diesel fuel consumption had to be monitored, precisely to ensure adequate heating and power generation through the long Antarctic winter, when resupply flights became impossible. Due to weather conditions, the storage shed was connected to the main facility by a marked path that had been established through years of repeated use, but the route required leaving the climate-controlled environment and crossing open ground where wind speeds could reach lethal velocities without warning. I suited up in the extreme weather gear that was mandatory for any external activity. Insulated coveralls, face protection, emergency beacon, and radio equipment that would maintain contact with station personnel during the brief time required to complete the inventory. The cold was unlike anything I had experienced during temperate climate winters, not just the absence of warmth, but an active, aggressive presence that seemed to attack exposed skin and seek entry through any gap in protective clothing. The wind carried particles of ice that struck exposed surfaces with sufficient force to leave marks, and the sound of air moving around the station's structures created an acoustic environment that masked normal environmental cues. It was while I was checking fuel levels and recording meter readings that I first heard the knocking. The sound came from the direction of the main station, rhythmic and deliberate, clearly audible despite the wind noise that should have masked any sound generated by normal mechanical processes. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. A pattern too regular to be coincidental, too purposeful to be explained by random environmental factors. I checked my watch. 3:17 a.m. The rules sheet's second prohibition flickered through my memory. If you hear knocking at the door after 3 a.m., do not answer. My first instinct was to investigate. Someone might be in distress, might need assistance, might be trying to communicate important information about station operations or emergency conditions. But the knocking continued with mechanical precision, never varying in rhythm or intensity. never accompanied by voices or other sounds that would suggest human origin. I completed the fuel inventory with hands that shook slightly from more than just cold exposure, forcing myself to maintain normal procedure while the knocking continued in the background, like an audio beacon marking time according to schedules I didn't understand. The sound was clear, undeniable, impossible to dismiss as imagination or environmental interference. When I returned to the station and cycled through the airlock, the knocking stopped immediately. The sudden silence felt more ominous than the sound had been, as if whatever had been producing the audio stimulus was aware of my location and had adjusted its behavior. Accordingly, Dr. Harper was in the communications center, updating weather data with the methodical precision that characterized all station operations. I approached her with questions that felt simultaneously urgent and absurd. "Did anyone else hear knocking outside a few minutes ago?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual despite the adrenaline that was still affecting my heart rate. Harper looked up from her paperwork with an expression that suggested she'd been expecting this conversation. "You followed the rule." "What rule?" "How you didn't answer the knocking." I stared at her, trying to process the implications of a response that treated supernatural phenomena as routine operational considerations. "You mean the knocking was real?" "Someone was actually—" "Someone," Harper interrupted, "is not the correct term. The knocking occurs regularly during winter months. Personnel who investigate the source don't return to file reports about what they discover." She returned to her data entry with the calm efficiency of someone discussing routine maintenance, schedules rather than supernatural predation. I wanted to demand explanations, to insist on rational analysis of phenomena that couldn't exist according to any scientific framework I understood. Instead, I found myself asking a different question. How many people have we lost to the knocking? Harper's expression grew distant, as if she were performing calculations that involved more variables than simple arithmetic could accommodate. "Officially, no personnel losses. Station Kepler has an exemplary safety record, according to Research Council documentation." She locked her paperwork in a desk drawer and prepared to leave the communications center, but paused to offer guidance that felt more like warning than advice. "The rules exist because this location presents challenges that aren't covered in standard Antarctic survival training," she said. "Phenomena that can't be explained but must be survived. Your compliance with protocol tonight probably saved your life." After Harper left, I sat in the communications center and tried to apply rational analysis to events that resisted logical explanation. The knocking had been real, audible, consistent, clearly distinguishable from environmental noise. But Harper's matter-of-fact discussion of supernatural activity suggested that Station Kepler operated according to principles that extended beyond conventional research facility management. I reviewed the station's technical specifications, looking for equipment or systems that might produce rhythmic knocking sounds during normal operation. The heating system operated on automated cycles, but the patterns didn't match what I'd heard outside. The communications equipment generated various audio signals, but none that would be audible at the distance between the fuel storage area and the main facility. The wind continued its constant assault on the station's exterior. But now I found myself listening for patterns within the ambient noise, trying to identify sounds that might not be generated by natural atmospheric processes. The acoustic environment that had seemed merely unusual during my first few days now felt actively hostile, filled with audio cues that suggested the presence of entities or activities that couldn't be explained through conventional environmental monitoring. I spent the remainder of the night reviewing the station rules, trying to understand the underlying logic that made compliance essential for survival in an environment where normal safety protocols apparently provided insufficient protection against threats that existed beyond the comfortable boundaries of scientific materialism. The knocking didn't repeat, but I understood that the silence was temporary. Whatever had been testing the station's defenses would return when conditions were appropriate, when personnel were vulnerable, when the rules provided the only barrier between survival and becoming another unexplained disappearance that would be filed under equipment malfunction or failure to follow established protocols. Outside, the Antarctic wind carried sounds that might have been natural weather phenomena or might have been something else entirely, testing the boundaries of human perception and human endurance in an environment where the difference between life and death could be measured in seconds of exposure or moments of inattention to warnings that had been developed through trial and error by people who hadn't survived the learning process. Ben Rodriguez arrived at Station Kepler during my second week of residency, flown in as part of a scheduled personnel rotation that brought fresh researchers to replace those who had completed their Antarctic assignments. He was a climatologist from the University of Colorado, experienced in cold weather research and possessed of the confident competence that comes from successfully navigating challenging environments through superior preparation and rational problem-solving approaches. Ben's arrival coincided with the beginning of the polar night period, when the sun would remain below the horizon for the next 4 months, leaving Station Kepler dependent entirely on artificial illumination and heating, systems that represented the only barriers between human survival and an environment that could kill unprotected personnel in minutes. During his orientation briefing, Ben reviewed the station rules with obvious amusement, reading through the prohibitions with the skeptical attention of someone trained to identify logical fallacies in institutional documentation. "Shadowy figures near the fuel tanks," he said, consulting the laminated sheet while unpacking equipment in his assigned quarters. "Someone's been reading too much Lovecraft. These are psychological management tools, right? Ways to keep personnel from wandering around in conditions that could cause real safety problems." I tried to explain the knocking incident, the matter-of-fact way Dr. Harper had discussed supernatural phenomena as routine operational hazards. The growing certainty that Station Kepler's isolated location presented challenges that weren't covered in standard research protocols. Ben listened with the polite attention of someone humoring a colleague who was showing signs of isolation-induced paranoia. "Cabin fever," he diagnosed confidently. "Classic symptoms of prolonged exposure to confined spaces and social isolation." The human brain manufactures explanations for unusual stimuli, especially when those stimuli occur in contexts that trigger evolutionary alarm responses. Ben's dismissal of the rules as institutional psychology rather than survival protocol became a source of constant friction during daily operations. He treated the prohibitions as suggestions, interpreted warnings as recommendations, and approached Antarctic hazards with the confidence of someone who believed superior equipment and training could overcome any environmental challenge. The confrontation came during our third week together, when Ben announced his intention to investigate the station's perimeter independently during the overnight shift. Dr. Harper was conducting communications duties in the main facility, leaving Ben and me responsible for routine monitoring and maintenance tasks that could be completed without direct supervision. "I want to get baseline measurements of ambient electromagnetic activity," Ben explained, organizing portable monitoring equipment with professional efficiency. "The station's location makes it ideal for studying atmospheric electrical phenomena that aren't observable at lower latitudes." I reminded him of the first rule: never approach the outer perimeter at night, and tried to explain the growing body of evidence that suggested the prohibitions were based on practical experience rather than arbitrary institutional control. Ben's response was predictably dismissive. "Environmental hazards," he said, checking battery levels on his equipment with casual confidence. "Crevasse formations, unstable ice conditions, maybe some geological instability that could cause problems for personnel who don't understand the local terrain." Characteristics: he suited up in full extreme weather gear and activated his emergency beacon, following all established protocols for external activity, except the one that mattered most: compliance with rules that had been developed to govern interactions with entities that existed beyond conventional environmental monitoring. I watched through the observation window as Ben's headlamp disappeared into the darkness beyond the station's illuminated perimeter, moving steadily away from the facility toward areas that had never been fully mapped or surveyed by station personnel. His radio transmissions were routine, professional, reporting normal atmospheric conditions and equipment function according to standard communication protocols. The first indication of problems came approximately 40 minutes after Ben left the station, when his radio transmissions began showing signs of interference that couldn't be explained by atmospheric conditions or equipment malfunction. Static interrupted his reports, and when his voice came through clearly, it carried tonal qualities that suggested stress or confusion, despite his continued use of professional terminology. Bass, "This is Rodriguez," came through clearly, then dissolved into electronic noise that lasted several seconds. Getting some unusual readings here. Electromagnetic activity is more static. Then silence. I attempted to re-establish contact but received no response to repeated calls. Dr. Harper joined me in the communications center, monitoring the radio frequencies while tracking Ben's emergency beacon on the station's navigation system. The beacon showed his location as approximately 800 meters from the facility, moving in patterns that suggested confusion or disorientation, rather than purposeful scientific investigation. Then the beacon signal disappeared entirely. We maintained radio watch through the remainder of the night, broadcasting on all frequencies, monitoring emergency channels, following protocols designed for personnel recovery in extreme weather conditions. But no additional transmissions came from Ben's equipment, and his emergency beacon remained inactive, despite battery systems that should have functioned for at least 72 hours under normal operating conditions. At 6:30, as the first grey light of dawn began to illuminate the Antarctic landscape, a figure appeared at the station's main entrance. Ben was walking slowly across the snow, moving with the mechanical precision of someone suffering from severe hypothermia or exhaustion. His extreme weather gear appeared intact, his equipment was properly secured, and his approach followed the marked path with no deviation from established safety procedures. But something was fundamentally wrong with his appearance, his movement, his response to external stimuli. I opened the airlock and helped Ben through the entry cycle, noting that his exposed skin was pale beyond normal cold exposure, almost translucent, with a waxy quality that suggested tissue damage from prolonged temperature extremes. His eyes were open but unfocused, tracking movement with delay that indicated neurological impairment or shock. When I touched his arm to guide him toward the medical station, his skin felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with environmental exposure, not the surface chill that resulted from external temperature, but deep internal cold that seemed to emanate from within. His body, as if his core temperature had been fundamentally altered by processes that couldn't be explained. Through normal hypothermic progression, Ben collapsed in the station's main corridor, his breathing shallow and irregular, his pulse weak but detectable. I began emergency warming procedures while Dr. Harper monitored his vital signs, but his condition continued to deteriorate, despite interventions that should have been adequate for treating cold exposure injuries. In his final moments of consciousness, Ben spoke in a whisper, barely audible above the station's mechanical background noise. They were waiting. "They've been waiting so long?" He died approximately 20 minutes after returning to the station, his body temperature never rising above dangerously hypothermic levels despite aggressive warming. Protocols and medical intervention. Dr. Harper certified the death as environmental exposure complicated by unknown factors, and Ben's remains were prepared for transport, according to procedures that had apparently been established through previous experience with similar casualties. But the other station personnel treated Ben's death with a matter-of-fact acceptance that suggested such incidents were anticipated rather than extraordinary, routine occupational hazards rather than unexplained tragedies that demanded investigation and explanation. I realized, sitting in the medical station while Dr. Harper completed paperwork that documented Ben's death without speculating about its causes, that the rules weren't suggestions designed to prevent minor safety infractions. They were antibodies developed by an organization that had learned to function in an environment where conventional understanding of environmental hazards provided inadequate protection against threats that existed beyond the comfortable boundaries of scientific materialism. Ben's confidence had killed him. His expertise, his preparation, his rational dismissal of phenomena that couldn't be explained had made him vulnerable to entities that had been waiting at the station's perimeter with patience that could outlast individual research assignments, individual careers, individual lifetimes spent trying to understand forces that could only be survived through absolute compliance with protocols that worked without explanation. Ben's death created an administrative vacuum that Dr. Harper filled by assigning me additional responsibilities, while replacement personnel underwent the screening and transportation processes required for Antarctic deployment. The increased workload gave me access to station records and documentation that had previously been restricted to senior personnel, including archives that contained decades of incident reports and operational logs that painted a disturbing picture of Station Kepler's operational history. I found the first clues in a filing cabinet labeled Personnel Records Historical, which contained employment documentation dating back to the station's original construction in the late 1970s. The files showed a pattern of unusually high personnel turnover, with most researchers completing only partial assignments before requesting emergency transfer to other facilities or simply abandoning their positions without formal notification. Buried among routine administrative paperwork, I discovered personal journals and unofficial logs that previous station personnel had apparently left behind when they departed. The entries were written in different handwritings, spanning multiple decades, but they described consistent phenomena that suggested Station Kepler's isolated location presented challenges that weren't covered in official research documentation. A journal entry dated March 15, 1983, written in careful cursive by someone identified only as Dr. K, described events that matched my own experiences with disturbing accuracy. The knocking continues nightly, always after 3 a.m., always with the same rhythm. Personnel who investigate don't return. Those who ignore the sound report seeing figures moving near the fuel storage area, tall, thin shapes that seem to absorb light rather than reflecting it. Base management treats these incidents as routine operational hazards. Another entry, dated October 7, 1991, provided additional details about the entities that apparently resided in the area surrounding Station Kepler. Electromagnetic monitoring equipment registers anomalous signatures during periods of supernatural activity. Whatever exists beyond our perimeter appears to generate fields that interfere with standard instruments, while remaining invisible to optical observation. The shadows mentioned in station folklore aren't absence of light, they're presence of something that interacts with electromagnetic spectrum in ways our equipment can't properly measure. I found references to seismic monitoring data that showed irregular subsurface activity patterns inconsistent with normal geological processes, suggesting that something large and active existed beneath the ice in the vicinity of Station Kepler. The reports were technical, carefully documented, but they described phenomena that couldn't be explained through conventional understanding of Antarctic geological conditions. A research summary dated 1994 contained the most disturbing information. Ground penetrating. Radar indicates extensive cavern systems beneath station location, but acoustic probes suggest these spaces aren't empty. Reflective patterns indicate presence of structures, possibly organic, possibly artificial, that appear to respond to surface activity. Station Kepler may have been constructed directly above some form of hibernating entity or ecosystem that becomes active during winter months when electromagnetic conditions change due to polar night effects. The documentation painted a picture of an organization that had gradually developed protocols for managing supernatural phenomena rather than studying them through conventional scientific methods. Station Kepler wasn't primarily a research facility, it was a monitoring post designed to observe and contain entities that had been discovered during initial Antarctic exploration, but which couldn't be officially acknowledged without compromising national security and international research agreements. In a locked drawer that I accessed using techniques learned during graduate school pranks, I found Dr. Harper's personal logbook, which contained entries that revealed the true purpose of Station Kepler's continued operation, year 23 of observation duty. Winter phenomena remain consistent with previous documentation. Entities show increased activity during polar night period, but remain contained within established perimeter boundaries as long as personnel follow containment protocols. Rules continue. To be effective for maintaining operational security, while preventing casualties that would attract unwanted investigation. I understood then that the rules weren't safety guidelines developed through trial and error. They were diplomatic protocols established through decades of careful negotiation with entities that possessed territorial claims predating human presence in Antarctica by geological time periods. Station Kepler existed to monitor and manage contact with forces that couldn't be destroyed or controlled, only appeased through careful demonstration of respect for boundaries that existed beyond any government's authority to regulate. The facility's scientific mission was secondary to its primary function as an observation post maintaining surveillance on entities that represented potential threats to human activity across the entire Antarctic continent. The research conducted at Station Kepler was real but limited, cover stories that provided plausible explanations for the facility's continued operation while concealing activities that couldn't be officially acknowledged. Reading through decades of documentation, I began to understand the psychological toll that long-term assignment at Station Kepler imposed on personnel who had to function effectively while acknowledging reality that existed beyond comfortable boundaries of scientific materialism. The high turnover rate wasn't due to harsh environmental conditions. It was the result of cumulative exposure to phenomena that gradually eroded conventional worldview until personnel could no longer maintain the cognitive compartmentalization required for normal social functioning. Dr. Harper had survived 23 years at Station Kepler by developing mental frameworks that treated supernatural phenomena as environmental hazards, requiring specialized management protocols rather than mysteries demanding scientific investigation. Her matter-of-fact approach to impossible events represented professional competence rather than emotional detachment, the accumulated wisdom of someone who had learned to navigate reality that couldn't be explained but had to be survived. As I returned the files to their proper locations and prepared for another night of monitoring duties, I realized that my assignment to Station Kepler represented more than career advancement in Antarctic research. I had been recruited into an organization that maintained humanity's most isolated outpost, not for scientific discovery, but for diplomatic relations with entities that possessed intelligence, patience, and territorial sovereignty that preceded human civilization by millions of years. The rules weren't restrictions, they were treaty obligations, and adherence to them wasn't just survival protocol, but compliance with agreements that kept forces beyond human understanding contained within boundaries that protected the rest of humanity from direct contact with powers that could reshape the planet's climate, geography, and habitability according to preferences that might not include continued human existence. Outside Station Kepler, the Antarctic wind continued its constant commentary on the fragility of human shelter, and beneath the ice, something ancient and patient continued monitoring human activity with intelligence that had been studying our species since long before we developed the technology necessary to reach the polar regions and discover that we weren't the only forms of consciousness that had evolved on Earth. The revelation came during my 6th week at Station Kepler, when a severe blizzard confined all personnel to the main facility for 3 consecutive days. The storm was unlike the routine weather systems I'd experienced since arriving in Antarctica. Winds exceeding 120 kilometers per hour, visibility reduced to 0, and temperatures dropping to levels that would freeze exposed human tissue in seconds despite the extreme weather gear that normally provided adequate protection for brief external activity. During the enforced isolation, Dr. Harper and I found ourselves sharing extended periods in the communications center, monitoring weather data, and maintaining contact with other Antarctic research facilities. It was during these quiet hours, while atmospheric conditions prevented normal operational activity, that Harper began providing information about Station Kepler's true purpose and her role as guardian of secrets that couldn't be officially acknowledged. 24 years, she said, reviewing storm tracking data with the methodical precision that characterized all her professional activities. 24 winters of managing contact protocols with entities that most people couldn't accept as real, even if presented with direct physical evidence. She gestured toward the observation windows, where nothing was visible beyond the storm, except darkness so complete it seemed to absorb the facility's external lighting. Station Kepler was established in 1978, following discovery of anomalous seismic activity during preliminary site surveys for Antarctic research facilities. Initial investigation teams reported equipment malfunctions, personnel disappearances, and phenomena that couldn't be explained through conventional geological or meteorological analysis. Harper opened a locked file drawer and withdrew documentation that appeared to be classified at levels beyond normal. Research facility security protocols. The papers contained photographs, technical specifications, and incident reports that painted a picture of systematic investigation into supernatural phenomena conducted by personnel with military rather than academic backgrounds. The entities beneath the ice have been here since before human evolution, she continued, spreading geological survey maps across the duty table. Ground-penetrating radar indicates cavern systems extending hundreds of kilometers in all directions, but acoustic analysis suggests these spaces contain structures, possibly cities, that show signs of current habitation. The photographs showed electromagnetic field measurements, seismic activity patterns, and atmospheric disturbance data that documented the presence of large-scale organized activity beneath Station Kepler's location. But the most disturbing images were thermal scans that revealed heat signatures consistent with biological activity on a massive scale, temperatures and distribution. Patterns that suggested the presence of living entities, with body mass comparable to large marine mammals, but existing in environments that shouldn't support complex life forms. The rules were developed through trial and error, Harper explained, organizing the documentation with careful attention to security protocols that governed handling of classified materials. Early station personnel who violated the protocols provided information about entity behavior patterns and territorial boundaries. Through their disappearances and the conditions under which their remains were recovered, she showed me incident reports describing researchers who had ignored the prohibition against approaching the perimeter at night, whose bodies had been found arranged in patterns that suggested examination rather than predation. Personnel who had answered the knocking had vanished entirely, leaving behind equipment that showed signs of exposure to electromagnetic fields far exceeding anything that could be generated by natural atmospheric phenomena. The knocking isn't communication, Harper said. It's testing, systematic evaluation of human responses to audio stimuli designed to trigger evolutionary alarm patterns. Personnel who respond to the knocking provide the entities with opportunities to study human physiology and psychology under controlled conditions. The implications of her explanation were horrifying in their casual matter-of-factness. Station Kepler existed as a research facility, but the research being conducted wasn't entirely under human direction. The entities beneath the ice were studying human behavior with scientific methodology, using the facility's personnel as experimental subjects while maintaining the pretense of cooperation through careful adherence to territorial boundaries established. Through decades of diplomatic negotiation, the shadows near the fuel tanks are reconnaissance operations, Harper continued, consulting thermal imaging data that showed temperature anomalies moving in patterns too coordinated to be natural phenomena. They appear during periods when station activity suggests vulnerability or when new personnel arrive who might not understand the importance of following established protocols. I asked the question that had been growing in importance since Ben's death. What happens if the rules are violated systematically? If someone deliberately tests the boundaries? Harper's expression grew distant, as if she were remembering incidents that had required responses not covered in normal diplomatic protocols. The entities have demonstrated ability to extend their influence beyond the immediate station perimeter when territorial agreements are violated. Personnel who break multiple rules simultaneously or who attempt to study the entities through conventional scientific methods trigger defensive responses that can affect much larger geographical areas. She showed me satellite imagery from 1987 depicting an electromagnetic disturbance that had affected an area of approximately 2,000 square kilometers around Station Kepler. The disturbance had disabled all electronic equipment within the affected zone for 72 hours, including emergency beacons, communication systems, and aircraft navigation instruments. 3 research teams had vanished during the incident, and subsequent investigation had revealed evidence of seismic activity suggesting massive subsurface movement. "The rules aren't just survival protocols," Harper said, locking the classified documentation back in its secured storage. "They're diplomatic agreements that prevent escalation from containment to active conflict. As long as human presence here remains limited and respectful of established boundaries, the entities tolerate our monitoring activities. If we violate the agreements, they have demonstrated ability to eliminate human presence from Antarctica entirely." The storm continued for another 18 hours, during which Harper provided additional details about Station Kepler's operational history and the psychological toll of maintaining diplomatic relations with entities that possessed intelligence and technology that made human scientific achievement seem primitive by comparison. Her matter-of-fact discussion of impossible phenomena represented more than professional competence. It was the accumulated wisdom of someone who had learned to function effectively while acknowledging reality that existed beyond any framework taught in academic institutions. When the weather cleared enough to resume normal operations, I understood that my role at Station Kepler extended beyond routine research activities. I had been recruited into humanity's most isolated diplomatic mission, maintaining peaceful coexistence with forces that could reshape planetary climate according to preferences that might not include continued human habitability. The rules weren't restrictions. They were treaty obligations that protected not just Station Kepler's personnel, but potentially the entire human species from direct contact with entities that had been monitoring our development, since long before we possessed the technology necessary to reach their domain and discover that intelligence on Earth had evolved along multiple independent pathways that intersected in ways that required careful management to prevent conflicts that could threaten the survival of all involved parties. The crisis arrived during my 9th week at Station Kepler, when a catastrophic failure in the main power distribution system plunged the facility into total darkness for what would become the longest 6 hours of my life. The blackout occurred at 11:47 p.m. during a period of severe weather that prevented immediate access to backup generators housed in the external maintenance facility. Emergency battery systems provided minimal lighting for essential safety equipment, but the heating systems, communication arrays, and perimeter security monitors all went offline simultaneously. Dr. Harper immediately implemented emergency protocols, organizing personnel to maintain critical systems using portable equipment while attempting to restore primary power through manual intervention procedures that required external facility access in conditions that were marginal for human survival, even with full environmental protection. The temperature inside Station Kepler began dropping within minutes of the heating system failure, and without active atmospheric processing, carbon dioxide levels would become dangerous within hours. It was during the 2nd hour of the blackout that we heard the voice calling from outside the station's main entrance. The voice belonged to Dr. Sarah Chen, my former colleague from graduate school at the University of Washington, someone I hadn't seen in over 2 years, but whose vocal patterns I would recognize anywhere. She was calling my name with increasing urgency, explaining that her research helicopter had crashed during the storm, that she was injured and suffering from severe hypothermia, that she needed immediate medical attention to survive until rescue teams could reach our location. "Elliot," she called through the storm, her voice carrying clearly despite wind conditions that should have made communication impossible at the distance suggested by the volume and clarity of her transmissions. "I know you're in there. Please, I'm hurt and I can't feel my legs." The emotional manipulation was surgically precise. Sarah's voice carried exactly the right combination of pain, fear, and desperate hope that would trigger every instinct I developed during my EMT training to provide immediate assistance to people in medical distress. Her pleas for help were accompanied by specific details about our shared academic history, personal information that would be impossible for anyone else to know, references to conversations and experiences that confirmed the caller's identity beyond reasonable doubt. Dr. Harper appeared beside me in the communications center, monitoring the situation with the grim attention of someone who had encountered similar scenarios before. When I reached for the door controls, she grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "Rule number 2, she said firmly. "No matter what you hear, no matter who it sounds like, do not answer knocking or calling after 3 a.m. I checked my watch, 1:23 a.m., but Sarah's voice was unmistakably real, undeniably familiar, carrying medical urgency that couldn't be ignored without violating every principle of emergency response that had been drilled into me during years of training. She was describing symptoms consistent with severe hypothermia and possible spinal injury from the helicopter crash, conditions that would prove fatal within hours without immediate intervention. "That's Dr. Sarah Chen," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, despite the adrenaline that was affecting my ability to think clearly. She was my research partner at University of Washington. She must have been conducting winter research when the storm hit. Harper's expression remained implacable. "Personnel records show no scheduled flights in this sector during the current weather system. No helicopter crashes have been reported to Antarctic Rescue Coordination. The voice you're hearing isn't coming from someone who needs medical assistance." But Sarah continued calling, providing additional details about her condition that were medically accurate and emotionally devastating. She described the crash, explained how she had managed to reach Station Kepler despite her injuries, pleaded with me to ignore whatever protocols were preventing me from opening the door to save her life. The moral weight of the situation was overwhelming. Every aspect of my medical and scientific training demanded immediate response to clear distress calls from identifiable colleagues who were describing life-threatening conditions requiring intervention that only I could provide. But Harper's warnings echoed with accumulated authority of someone who had learned to navigate impossible choices through direct experience with consequences that couldn't be adequately explained but had to be respected. "She's going to die if we don't help her," I said, reaching again for the door controls despite Harper's continued restraint. "She's already dead," Harper replied with matter-of-fact certainty that carried no trace of doubt or emotional response. "Whatever is using her voice learned about your psychological vulnerabilities through methods that don't require direct contact with your colleague. Opening that door won't save Dr. Chen. It will provide the entities with access to study human responses to moral dilemmas under controlled laboratory conditions." The voice outside grew more desperate, more personally targeted, cycling through emotional appeals that were perfectly calibrated to exploit my specific psychological profile and professional obligations. Sarah began describing details about our shared research projects that no one else could have known, using phrases and terminology that confirmed intimate familiarity with our academic relationship and personal friendship. Then the voice began changing, becoming something that still sounded like Sarah, but carried harmonic qualities that human vocal anatomy couldn't produce. Multiple tones generated simultaneously, words formed by structures that approximated human speech patterns without actually conforming to the physiological limitations that governed normal human communication. I backed away from the door, finally understanding that compliance with the rules wasn't cruelty toward people who needed help. It was recognition that some forms of help were traps, designed by entities that understood human psychology well enough to weaponize our virtues against us with surgical precision. The voice continued for another 40 minutes, cycling through various emotional and logical appeals while gradually becoming less recognizably human and more obviously artificial. By the time the main power systems were restored and Station Kepler returned to normal operational status, the calling had stopped entirely, replaced by silence that felt more ominous than the supernatural communication had been. When external lighting resumed operation, I looked through the observation windows toward the area where Sarah's voice had originated. The snow showed no footprints, no signs of helicopter wreckage, no evidence that anyone had approached the station from any direction during the previous 6 hours. Dr. Harper found me in the communications center, staring at monitoring equipment that showed no electromagnetic anomalies, no seismic disturbances, no indication that anything unusual had occurred during the power outage except for atmospheric conditions consistent with the severe weather system that was beginning to move away from Station Kepler's location. You made the right choice, she said, reviewing system status displays with professional efficiency. Personnel who respond to voices calling from outside the station don't survive to file reports about what they discover beyond the perimeter. I realized that I had crossed a threshold that couldn't be reversed. From someone learning to cope with unusual job requirements to someone who had internalized understanding that survival in certain environments required choosing protocol compliance over instinctive human responses to apparent emergency situations. The knowledge that Sarah's voice had been artificially generated by entities that possessed detailed information about my personal history and psychological vulnerabilities was more disturbing than any conventional threat I could imagine. The rules weren't arbitrary restrictions, they were armor against predation by forces that had studied human nature with scientific methodology and developed hunting strategies that could exploit our deepest virtues as effectively as our worst fears, and adherence to them, no matter how cruel it felt in the moment, was the only barrier between survival and becoming another data point in research, being conducted by intelligences that viewed human psychology as an interesting subject for systematic investigation. The final test began during my 11th week at Station Kepler, when a complete systems failure cascade shut down every piece of electronic equipment in the facility simultaneously. Unlike the previous power outage, which had been caused by mechanical problems with identifiable solutions, this blackout resulted from electromagnetic interference so intense it permanently damaged circuits that should have been protected against any natural phenomenon occurring in Earth's atmosphere. The failure started at 2:47 a.m. with communication equipment producing static patterns that registered on oscilloscopes as geometric shapes rather than random electronic noise. Within minutes, heating systems began cycling erratically. Lighting fixtures flickered in synchronized patterns across multiple circuits, and monitoring instruments displayed readings that violated basic principles of physics. Negative temperatures, electromagnetic field measurements exceeding theoretical maximums, seismic activity indicating subsurface movement of objects with mass comparable to mountain ranges. Dr. Harper activated emergency protocols that I hadn't seen during previous drills, locking down blast doors that isolated different sections of the facility and activating backup systems that appeared to be hardened against electromagnetic interference far exceeding anything that normal Antarctic research would require. Her movements carried military precision that suggested training for scenarios not covered in civilian emergency response procedures. Full containment breach, she announced, consulting instruments that continued functioning despite the electromagnetic chaos affecting standard equipment. Whatever's down there has decided the monitoring phase is complete. We're transitioning from diplomatic observation to active defensive measures. Through the facility's observation windows, the Antarctic landscape had become visible despite the complete absence of external lighting. The snow and ice were glowing with phosphorescent illumination that revealed details extending far beyond the normal range of human night vision. But the landscape itself was changing, ice formations shifting position, terrain features rearranging themselves according to patterns that suggested massive subsurface activity. The knocking began at exactly 3 a.m., but this time it wasn't coming from the station's entrance. The sound emanated from every external surface simultaneously. Walls, ceiling, floor, windows, as if the facility was being systematically examined by entities that surrounded Station Kepler on all sides and were conducting detailed analysis of its structural integrity and defensive capabilities. They're testing for entry points, Harper explained, monitoring portable instruments that tracked electromagnetic signatures moving around the facility's perimeter. Standard containment protocols are failing. The entities have decided that human presence here represents a threat that requires more active management, the voices began, shortly after the knocking, not the single artificial communication I'd experienced during the power outage, but a chorus of familiar voices calling from every direction. I heard Sarah Chen, Ben Rodriguez, my parents, colleagues from graduate school, people from my childhood, friends who had died years ago, all speaking simultaneously in overlapping conversations. That created an audio environment so psychologically disorienting. It was physically painful to process, but underneath the familiar voices was something else, a deep, rhythmic sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, subsonic frequencies that I could feel in my bones, rather than hear through normal auditory processing. The sound suggested something enormous moving beneath Station Kepler, something with mass and coordination that made human engineering achievements seem insignificant by comparison. "How long do we have?" I asked Harper, who was reviewing procedures in a manual I'd never seen before. Pages covered with technical diagrams, mathematical formulas, and instructions written in multiple languages, including several that didn't appear to use human alphabetic systems. "Depends on how quickly they can overcome the containment barriers," she replied, activating systems that began producing harmonic frequencies designed to interfere with the electromagnetic patterns generated by entity activity. The facility was designed to withstand direct assault for approximately 6 hours, assuming the entities choose to test our defenses systematically rather than applying maximum force immediately. The testing became more aggressive as the night progressed. Windows began cracking under pressure that wasn't atmospheric. Walls vibrated with frequencies that resonated through the facility's structural framework, and the temperature started dropping, despite emergency heating systems operating at maximum capacity. Whatever was surrounding Station Kepler possessed technology or natural abilities that could manipulate environmental conditions in ways that made human engineering seem primitive by comparison. At 4:30 a.m., something began speaking through the facility's communication systems, not radio transmissions, but direct manipulation of electronic circuits to produce sounds that bypassed normal audio equipment entirely. The voice was artificial, clearly generated by non-human intelligence, but it used human language with perfect grammatical structure and vocabulary that suggested detailed study of human communication patterns. "Human observers," the voice announced through speakers throughout the facility, "your monitoring activities have provided adequate data for our research requirements. Continued presence in this location is no longer necessary for the completion of our studies." Harper activated countermeasures that filled the facility with harmonic interference designed to disrupt the entity's ability to manipulate electronic systems. But the voice continued with implacable patience that suggested vast resources and unlimited time for achieving whatever objectives were driving the increased activity. "Departure from this location within the next solar rotation will be interpreted as compliance with territorial agreements that have governed human presence here since your initial intrusion. Failure to comply will necessitate more direct intervention in human activities." Across this planetary region, the implications were clear. Station Kepler's continued operation was being terminated by entities that possessed the power to enforce their territorial claims through methods that could affect human activity across the entire Antarctic continent. The diplomatic phase of contact was ending, replaced by ultimatum delivery that made further negotiation impossible. Harper began implementing evacuation protocols that involved destroying sensitive equipment, purging computer systems of classified data, and preparing the facility for abandonment according to procedures that had apparently been established for exactly this scenario. Her efficiency suggested that Station Kepler's mission had always been temporary, a monitoring operation designed to gather information about entities that would eventually reclaim their territory when human observation was no longer tolerated. 24 years of successful containment, she said, reviewing destruction procedures with methodical precision. Longer than most facilities achieve before territorial agreements require renegotiation through force majeure clauses. The final hours passed in systematic preparation for departure. That felt more like strategic withdrawal than emergency evacuation. Harper's procedures were designed to leave no evidence of human intelligence gathering activities while ensuring that the entity's territorial sovereignty would be respected through complete cessation of monitoring operations that had apparently been conducted under temporary agreements that were now being revoked. As dawn approached, the electromagnetic interference began subsiding, and the mechanical sounds from beneath the ice shifted to frequencies that suggested the massive subsurface activity was returning to dormant status. Station Kepler had survived the night. But survival had come at the cost of acknowledging that human presence in certain locations was conditional, temporary, subject to revision by intelligences that possessed authority predating any government's jurisdiction by geological time periods. The evacuation helicopter arrived exactly on schedule, as if the timing had been coordinated through communication channels I hadn't been aware existed. As we prepared to leave Station Kepler permanently, I understood that my experience there had been educational rather than occupational, training in recognition of reality that existed beyond comfortable boundaries of human knowledge, preparation for functioning in a world where human authority was provisional, and human survival sometimes depended on respecting powers that preferred to remain officially unacknowledged. The evacuation helicopter lifted off from Station Kepler at 0847 hours, carrying Dr. Harper and me away from a facility that would be officially listed as decommissioned due to equipment obsolescence, rather than abandoned under supernatural duress. As we gained altitude, I watched the station buildings disappear into the white expanse of the Antarctic plateau, looking like abandoned toys against a landscape so vast it made human engineering seem temporary by comparison. The debriefing took place at McMurdo Base, the largest research facility in Antarctica, where officials who possessed security clearances, far exceeding normal academic requirements, conducted interviews that covered topics not found in standard incident report procedures. The questions revealed detailed knowledge of phenomena that weren't supposed to exist according to official scientific documentation, and my responses were recorded using equipment that suggested the interviews would be classified at levels beyond normal. Research facility security protocols. Station Kepler has provided valuable data about subsurface activity patterns, explained Colonel Morrison, a military liaison whose presence at a civilian research facility raised questions that weren't addressed during the official briefing sessions. Your observations during the final containment period will contribute to improved protocols for future monitoring operations in similar locations. The implication was clear. Station Kepler hadn't been an isolated incident, but part of a larger program that maintained observation posts at locations where human activity intersected with entities that required careful management through diplomatic rather than military approaches. My experience there had been educational, providing training in recognition of reality that extended beyond comfortable boundaries of scientific materialism, but the psychological effects of extended exposure to supernatural phenomena couldn't be addressed through normal debriefing procedures. Even at McMurdo Base, surrounded by hundreds of personnel and modern communication systems that connected the facility to global networks, I found myself listening for audio cues that might indicate entity activity, monitoring electromagnetic equipment for anomalies that could suggest surveillance by intelligences that possessed technology beyond human. Understanding the dreams started during my second week at McMurdo Base, not nightmares in any conventional sense, but educational sessions that provided information about territorial boundaries, diplomatic protocols, and behavioral patterns that governed interaction between human civilization and entities that had been monitoring our development since long before we possessed the technology necessary to reach their domain. Would wake each morning with knowledge I hadn't possessed the night before, understanding of agreements that protected human activity in certain geographical areas while restricting access to regions that remained under the jurisdiction of intelligences that viewed human expansion with patient tolerance rather than active cooperation. The information came without emotional content, delivered as factual briefing material rather than threatening communication. Dr. Harper visited me several times during the debriefing period, sharing coffee and observations about the psychological adjustment process that followed, extended exposure to phenomena that couldn't be explained through conventional academic frameworks. Her conversations included practical advice about managing the cognitive dissonance that resulted from knowing about reality that couldn't be discussed in normal social or professional contexts. 30 years of monitoring operations, she said, During one evening conversation that took place in McMurdo Base's communication center, where background radio chatter provided acoustic cover for discussions that couldn't be conducted in areas where conversations might be overheard by personnel without appropriate security clearances. 30 years of learning that human civilization exists within boundaries that are more complex than most people understand. She explained that my assignment to Station Keeler had been part of a recruitment process that identified personnel capable of functioning effectively while acknowledging reality that extended beyond comfortable understanding. The position hadn't been advertised through normal academic channels. I had been selected through evaluation procedures that assessed psychological resilience, intellectual flexibility, and ability to maintain operational security while processing information that couldn't be shared through normal professional networks. The knowledge changes you, Harper continued, reviewing weather data with the methodical precision that had characterized her work at Station Keeler. Not psychological damage, expansion of awareness to include information that helps personnel function more effectively in environments where conventional training provides inadequate preparation for challenges that require acknowledging forces beyond human authority. Began to understand that my career in geophysics would continue, but in contexts that involved considerations extending beyond normal academic research. The skills I had developed during my time at Station Keeler, recognition of electromagnetic anomalies, ability to function under psychological pressure, compliance with protocols that worked without explanation, qualified me for assignments that couldn't be described in conventional academic terms. The transfer orders arrived during my 4th week at McMurdo Base, directing me to report to a research facility in northern Canada, where similar monitoring operations were conducted under cover of atmospheric studies and geological surveys. The facility's mission involved maintaining observation of entities that had been discovered during resource exploration activities, but which couldn't be officially acknowledged without compromising national security and international research agreements. As I prepared to leave Antarctica, I realized that the continent's vast white landscape had become permanently associated in my memory with the understanding that human knowledge was incomplete in ways that required careful management by people who had learned to function effectively while acknowledging reality that existed beyond any framework taught in academic institutions. The flight back to civilization took 18 hours, passing over landscapes that looked normal from altitude, but which I now knew contained phenomena that required specialized protocols for safe human interaction. The world looked the same as it had when I departed for Station Keeler, but my perception of it had been fundamentally altered by knowledge that couldn't be unlearned or ignored. I carried with me the understanding that human civilization existed within a larger context that included intelligences and forces that had been monitoring our development with scientific methodology, territorial sovereignty that preceded any government's authority by geological time periods, and diplomatic relationships that protected human activity through agreements that most people would never know existed. The rules from Station Keeler remained vivid in my memory, not as arbitrary restrictions but as survival protocols that worked because they acknowledged reality extending beyond comfortable boundaries of scientific materialism. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I retained awareness that the knocking might return someday, in different contexts, testing human responses to phenomena that required respect rather than investigation, compliance rather than understanding, acceptance rather than conquest. 6 months after my departure from Station Keeler, I received notification through secure communication channels that replacement personnel were being deployed to re-establish monitoring operations at the Antarctic facility. The message came through networks that didn't appear in normal academic or government communication systems, suggesting that the oversight organization responsible for managing supernatural phenomena operated through channels that existed parallel to, but separate from, conventional institutional structures. The replacement team consisted of 3 researchers: Dr. James Patterson, a meteorologist from MIT, Dr. Lisa Chen, a geologist from Stanford, and Dr. Mark Sullivan, an electronics specialist from the University of Michigan. All three possessed academic credentials that qualified them for legitimate Antarctic research, but their selection had been based on psychological profiles and security clearances that indicated recruitment for purposes extending beyond conventional scientific investigation. I was assigned to conduct their orientation briefing, providing information about Station Keeler's operational procedures and safety protocols without revealing details about supernatural phenomena that couldn't be officially acknowledged. The Sauzi challenge was communicating essential survival information to personnel, whose worldview didn't include adequate preparation for acknowledging reality beyond comfortable boundaries of scientific materialism. Dr. Patterson approached the briefing with the confidence of someone who had successfully navigated challenging environments through superior preparation and rational problem-solving approaches. When I presented the station rules during the formal orientation session, his response was predictably skeptical. "These are pretty specific prohibitions," he said, reviewing the laminated instruction sheet with obvious amusement. "Never approach the outer perimeter at night. Don't answer knocking after 3 a.m. This reads like folklore rather than safety protocol." I tried to explain that the rules were based on practical experience rather than superstition, that compliance with seemingly irrational restrictions could mean the difference between successful completion of assignments and becoming another unexplained personnel loss in regions where conventional rescue operations were impossible. But Patterson's dismissal of the protocols was supported by his colleagues, who treated the prohibitions as evidence of institutional psychology rather than survival requirements. "Environmental hazards disguised as supernatural warnings," Dr. Chen diagnosed confidently. "Standard procedure for maintaining personnel discipline in isolated locations, where psychological pressure could lead to safety violations if people don't take precautions seriously." Dr. Sullivan was more direct in his assessment. "Someone's been reading too much Lovecraft. These are obviously management tools designed to prevent personnel from wandering around in conditions that could cause real problems." The three researchers departed for Station Keeler with equipment that was more sophisticated than what had been available during my assignment. Instruments capable of detecting electromagnetic anomalies, seismic disturbances, and atmospheric conditions that might provide scientific explanations for phenomena that previous personnel had attributed to supernatural activity. Their confidence was reinforced by access to communication systems that would maintain contact with McMurdo Base and other Antarctic facilities, ensuring that any unusual events could be immediately reported to personnel qualified to provide expert analysis. I monitored their progress through reports that were filed according to standard research protocols, documenting weather conditions, equipment status, and preliminary findings that suggested Station Keeler's location presented interesting opportunities for studying polar atmospheric phenomena and subsurface geological formations. The team's initial transmissions were routine, professional, consistent with expectations for competent researchers conducting legitimate scientific investigation in challenging but manageable environmental conditions. The first indication of problems came during their second week, when communication reports began showing gaps in scheduled transmissions and equipment readings that didn't correlate with expected atmospheric or geological conditions. Dr. Patterson's status updates mentioned unusual electromagnetic interference and acoustic anomalies that might indicate previously unknown geological activity, but his tone remained confident and scientific rather than concerned or alarmed. Then the scheduled communication stopped entirely. The rescue team reached Station Keeler after 3 days of weather delays, finding the facility intact but abandoned, with no signs of struggle or emergency evacuation procedures. The researchers' equipment was functioning normally. Their personal belongings remained undisturbed in their assigned quarters, and food supplies indicated that normal meal schedules had been maintained until approximately 48 hours before the rescue team's arrival. But Dr. Patterson, Dr. Chen, and Dr. Sullivan were nowhere to be found. The investigation revealed evidence that all three researchers had left the station simultaneously during night hours, walking in formation toward the outer perimeter area. That was specifically prohibited in the safety protocols they had dismissed as institutional superstition. Their tracks in the snow showed purposeful movement, rather than confused wandering, coordinated progression rather than individual decisions made under psychological distress. The tracks ended approximately 800 meters from Station Keeler's main facility, at a location where the snow showed signs of disturbance consistent with extensive subsurface activity. Ground-penetrating radar indicated cavern systems that extended far beyond the range of available surveying equipment, but acoustic probes suggested that these spaces weren't empty. The reflecting patterns indicated presence of structures and organized activity that defied conventional understanding of Antarctic geological conditions. The official report listed the researchers as missing under circumstances consistent with environmental hazard exposure, and Station Keeler was permanently decommissioned due to recurring equipment malfunctions and personnel safety concerns. The facility's true operational history was classified under protocols that ensured the information would remain inaccessible to personnel without appropriate security clearances and psychological preparation for processing data about phenomena that couldn't be officially acknowledged. But I knew the truth about what had happened to Dr. Patterson and his colleagues. They had tested the rules, treated survival protocols as suggestions rather than absolute requirements, and discovered that some forms of skepticism could be fatal when applied to phenomena that existed beyond the comfortable boundaries of scientific materialism. The entities beneath Station Keeler had been patient, allowing human monitoring operations to continue for decades, while studying our behavior patterns and psychological vulnerabilities through careful observation of personnel who followed established protocols. But researchers who violated the territorial agreements that governed human presence in their domain provided opportunities for more direct investigation of human physiology and psychology under laboratory conditions that couldn't be replicated through remote observation. Somewhere beneath the Antarctic ice, 3 confident scientists were learning that intelligence on Earth had evolved along multiple pathways that intersected in ways requiring careful diplomatic management to prevent conflicts that could threaten the survival of all involved parties. Their expertise, their preparation, their rational approach to environmental challenges had made them vulnerable to predation by entities that possessed technology and understanding that made human scientific achievement seem primitive by comparison. The cycle would continue. Other monitoring facilities in other locations would require personnel trained to acknowledge reality that extended beyond conventional academic frameworks, and recruitment would identify candidates capable of functioning effectively while processing information that couldn't be shared through normal professional networks. The rules would be presented to new personnel as safety protocols, dismissed by some as institutional superstition, followed by others who understood that survival in certain environments required treating impossible phenomena as routine operational hazards. And those who chose skepticism over compliance would provide educational opportunities for entities that had been studying human nature with scientific methodology since long before our species developed the cognitive capacity to recognize that we weren't alone on a planet that had given rise to multiple forms of intelligence, some of which possessed territorial claims predating human civilization by geological time periods. The Antarctic wind continued its constant commentary on the fragility of human shelter, and beneath the ice, something ancient and patient continued its research into human psychology, adding new data points to studies that would continue long. After individual researchers, individual careers, individual civilizations had provided their contributions to understanding that transcended the comfortable boundaries of any single species' perspective on reality.